14 of Europe's most powerful CEOs, men and women who control billions in African resources, sat in absolute silence. Their hands trembled. Their well-rehearsed arguments collapsed in front of them, and all it took was 7 minutes and 23 seconds of words from a 36-year-old soldier. This is the story of how President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso delivered one of the most devastating corporate takedowns in modern African history. No shouting, no threats, just clear, unshakable facts that rippled through boardrooms from Paris to Stockholm. But here's what makes it even more shocking: it wasn't supposed to happen this way. For years, the mahogany conference table inside Ouagadougou's International Business Center had been the stage where European executives divided African resources, like a Sunday roast. Yet today, that same table would witness something no one had prepared for. The silence was suffocating. 14 titans of European industry sat frozen, their expensive translation devices suddenly meaningless. Everyone understood perfectly what had just been said. Henrik Andersen, CEO of Nord Gold Mining, would later admit to his board that in 40 years of business across Africa, he had never been more shaken by a speech that contained not a single threat. But shaken doesn't capture it. What these executives felt was something deeper, a dawning realization that their world was about to change. Let's go back 3 hours earlier. Those same executives had stepped out of armored convoys, briefcases in hand, confident as ever. They were certain they could bend another African leader to their will. The European Business Council had planned this meeting weeks in advance. Their strategy was straightforward: pressure the young military leader into continuing the sweetheart deals that had served them for decades. Burkina Faso needed European investment. They told themselves Burkina Faso needed European expertise, European money. Or so they believed. As their black SUVs rolled through Ouagadougou's dusty streets that March morning, Marcus Richter, CEO of Titan Resources, was brimming with confidence. On the drive, he joked to his colleague, "This won't take long. These African leaders always cave when you show them the numbers." He was already checking his phone, planning his evening flight to Paris when something happened that none of them expected. The convoy finally stopped, but not at the presidential palace, not at the Ministry of Commerce. Instead, the motorcade pulled up in front of a modest community center in one of Ouagadougou's working class neighborhoods. Confusion spread instantly. "There must be some mistake," said Claude Maro, who represented 3 major French agricultural conglomerates. Her assistant quickly made a flurry of phone calls. But the message was clear. This was the right location. President Traoré was waiting inside. When the executives stepped through the doors, their confidence drained. What they saw made their blood run cold. The hall wasn't filled with polished officials and interpreters. It was crowded with miners, farmers, teachers, nurses, elderly women in traditional dress, and young people holding smartphones, cameras already rolling. This wasn't going to be a closed-door negotiation. It was a public reckoning. At exactly 10 o'clock, Ibrahim Traoré walked in. But instead of the tailored suit they were expecting, he wore simple military fatigues. No ceremony, no protocol. He went straight to a wooden podium that looked like it had been borrowed from a school. The executives shifted uneasily in their seats. Everything felt wrong. Where was the show of power they were used to? Where were the polished trappings of authority, things they could recognize, respect, and bargain with? Instead, a young soldier stood before them, and behind him, the eyes of his people unblinking, curious and utterly unafraid. "Gentlemen, ladies," Traoré began in perfect French, his voice strong and unamplified. "Thank you for accepting my invitation. I know you expected different surroundings, but I wanted you to speak not just to me, I wanted you to speak to Burkina Faso. These people around you, they are Burkina Faso." The executives exchanged nervous glances. They were already far off script. Henrik Andersen tugged at his tie. The air felt heavy, suffocating, though it wasn't just the heat making him sweat. Then Traoré pulled out a single sheet of paper, as casually as if it were a shopping list. What he read next exploded like a bomb in the room. "I have here the combined profits your 14 companies extracted from Burkina Faso last year, 17 billion euros. I also have the amount you paid in taxes, Traoré continued. 300 million euros. That's less than 2%. He let the silence stretch, the weight of the numbers pressing down like poison. Then his voice cut through again. But numbers are just numbers. Let me tell you what they mean. He turned and gestured toward an elderly woman seated in the front row. This is Mama Salamata. She worked in your gold mines for 30 years, Mr. Anderson. She earned 40 euros a month while extracting gold worth millions. Today, she cannot afford medicine for the arthritis caused by those same mines. Anderson's jaw tightened. He wanted to interject, to explain market rates and operational costs. But the quiet steel in Traoré's eyes made him stay silent. This was no longer a negotiation. It was something he had never faced in for decades of business in Africa. Mr. Richter, Traoré continued, turning toward the CEO of Titan Resources. Your company has drilled for oil in our northern regions. For 15 years, you've extracted for billion barrels. Do you know how many households in those regions have electricity? 7%. 7% have light, while you pump billions of dollars worth of oil from beneath their feet. The room froze. Even the young people with phones seemed to forget they were recording. Richter felt his collar tightening. He wanted to argue about infrastructure challenges, about the complexities of development. But the faces around him, the ordinary faces of Burkina Faso, made his arguments shrivel in his throat. Madame Maro, Traoré said, his tone calm but unwavering. Your agricultural companies control 60% of our arable land. You grow cotton for European fashion houses while Burkinabe children go hungry. Last year, you exported cotton worth 2 billion euros. The farmers who grew it earned less than $1 a day. Maro opened her mouth, then closed it again. The elderly women in traditional dress were watching her, not with rage, but with patient eyes as if they had waited decades to hear her response. She found she had none. Now, Traoré said, his voice gaining an edge of steel, I could seize your assets. I could nationalize your operations. Many of my advisors have urged me to do exactly that. Under international law, given the unconscionable terms of your contracts, it would be justified. Relief flickered across the executives. Faces short-lived relief. But I will not do that, Traoré continued, his tone steady, almost like a teacher explaining a lesson. Instead, I will give you a choice. You may stay in Burkina Faso but under new terms. 51% local ownership. A minimum wage of 300 euros per month for every worker. 30% of profits reinvested into local infrastructure. Environmental restoration funds managed by local communities. Full transparency in your financial records, made public and accessible. Or, he looked around the room, meeting every pair of eyes. You can leave. The silence that followed was suffocating. Finally, Jonathan Pierce, CEO of Meridian Extraction, found his voice. This is impossible. These terms would make our operations unprofitable. Our shareholders would never accept this. Traoré nodded slowly, as if Pierce had confirmed exactly what he already knew. I understand. He said, your shareholders' profits matter more than Burkinabe lives. That has been clear for decades. So leave. The bluntness landed like a hammer. No drama, no shouting, just fact, delivered with the weight of a judge's gavel. But you need us, stammered Wilhelm Krauss of Continental Mining, his voice cracking with desperation. Our technology, our expertise, our global market access. Without us, your economy will collapse. And for the first time, Traoré smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. Mr. Krauss, that's what you've told us for 60 years, that we need you more than you need us. But let me show you something. He took out his phone and connected it to a small projector. A map of Africa lit up the wall, green points glowing across the continent. As of this morning, we have agreements with 7 African nations for technical cooperation. Our combined engineering graduates number more than 1 million. We have partnerships with universities in China, India, and Russia for technology transfer. We have investment funds from the Middle East ready to replace every euro you remove. And most importantly, he gestured toward the young people in the audience. Their phones lifted once again, their eyes bright with something dangerously close to hope. We have them, this generation. A generation that refuses to accept Africa's role as a land that makes others rich, while remaining poor itself. David Lund, representing 3 Swedish telecommunications firms, tried a softer approach. President Traoré, surely these are opening positions. Surely we can negotiate, everything is negotiable. Traoré shook his head slowly. For the first time, his expression held a trace of pity. No, Mr. Lund. That is your way, not ours. Negotiation assumes both parties need something the other can provide. But we do not need you. We have what you need, our resources, our land, our labor, and you have nothing we cannot obtain elsewhere under fair terms. Fears spread through the room. This was not in their playbook. They had dealt with African leaders before. There was always a weakness, always a deal to strike, always a way to keep control. But this young soldier refused to play their game. He refused to even acknowledge that their game existed. You have 72 hours to decide. Traoré announced, stay under our terms or leave with whatever you can carry. Any assets you leave behind will be considered abandoned and returned to the Burkinabe people. This is theft, shouted Alejandro Romano, CEO of Apex Industries, finally breaking down. We have contracts, legal agreements. We will go to international courts. The room stiffened, waiting for Traoré's reply, but there was no anger, only calm dismissal. Mr. Romano, those contracts were signed with governments that did not represent their people. Contracts born of coercion, corruption, and colonial pressure have no moral validity. And as for international courts, he shrugged, utterly indifferent. Go ahead. Spend years in litigation. While you do, we will be building our country with partners who respect us. The meeting was ending, but before the executives could leave, Traoré added one final line, words that would echo across newspapers, television screens, and boardrooms around the world. Understand this before you go. This is not about hatred. We do not hate you. This is about justice. For too long, Africa has been treated like a plantation, and you, the overseers. That era ends today. Here in Burkina Faso, Traoré declared, you can be part of Africa's future as real partners, or you can remain part of its past. The choice is yours. As the executives filed out, their faces pale and drawn, they passed through crowds gathered outside. Thousands of Burkinabe had come, not to protest, not to cheer, but simply to witness. They stood in silence, watching these powerful men and women walk to their cars. No anger, no celebration. Only the quiet dignity of people who had finally heard their truth spoken to power. Inside the convoys, panic spread like a virus. Phones rang constantly. Emergency board meetings were called. On the fly, stock prices were already shifting as clips from the meeting began leaking online. Henrik Anderson was on his third frantic call to Stockholm when his assistant handed him a tablet. His blood froze. A livestream of the event had already been viewed over 2 million times. Comments poured in from across Africa and around the world. Finally, this is leadership. Burkina Faso leads, others will follow. The awakening has begun. A chill deeper than any African winter cut through him. This wasn't just about Burkina Faso anymore. If Traoré succeeded, if he forced them out or made them accept his terms, every African nation could demand the same. 14 corporations, representing revenues of more than 30 billion euros, now had 72 hours to decide the fate of their empires. By that evening, the expatriate community in Ouagadougou was in chaos. The Cercle Franque, the elite club where European executives had spent decades dividing Africa's resources over fine wine, now looked more like a war council than a social hall. Marcus Richter stood before a shaken group, trying to sound confident even as his hands betrayed him. We need to stand together. If we all refuse, he'll have no choice but to back down. The economic shock would be too great for them to survive. Claudette Marot shook her head. Her usual composure was gone. You didn't see his eyes, Marcus. He's not bluffing. He'd rather watch the economy crash and rebuild from ashes than keep these terms. Then we fight, barked Romano, his face flushed red from rage and whiskey. We have contracts. We have international law, the World Bank, the IMF. We have leverage. Jonathan Pierce let out a bitter laugh. Leverage? What leverage? Did you see those people in that room? They're ready for whatever comes, and those partnership deals he mentioned, they're real. I've already had calls from 3 Chinese firms lining up to replace us the moment we leave. The room erupted. Some argued for a united stand, others pushed for negotiation, while a few quietly slipped messages to their assistants, instructing them to book flights and liquidate assets across the city. In a modest government office, Traoré sat with his closest advisors. They looked like soldiers before a battle, nervous, but resolved. The markets will punish us, warned Finance Minister Patricia Ouagadougou. Our currency could collapse. Credit ratings will sink. Traoré nodded, calm as stone. I know. But what's the alternative? Another 60 years of being Europe's gas station and mine. Our people deserve better. Colonel Amadou Ouagadougou, his security chief, voiced the darker concern. They'll try to destabilize us, fund opposition groups, even attempt a coup. Let them try. Traoré replied, his voice steady as granite. The people are with US. You saw them today. They're ready. As the 72 hours ticked by like a countdown to doomsday, the drama intensified. 3 corporations announced immediate withdrawal. Their stock prices collapsed overnight, wiping out billions in market value. For others scrambled to renegotiate, dispatching lawyers and consultants like desperate envoys seeking an audience with a king. But Traoré refused to meet them. The terms are set was his only reply, relayed through intermediaries with the weight of carved stone. The French government stepped in. President Macron himself called Traoré. The conversation, later leaked through diplomatic channels, was icy. You are making a grave mistake, Macron warned. France has been Burkina Faso's partner for decades. Traoré's response was polite, but it carried steel. We are looking for partners, President Macron, not masters. The European Union threatened sanctions. The World Bank painted visions of catastrophe. The IMF muttered about economic isolation. But then something happened that no one in Europe expected. Other African nations began to roar. Mali announced a review of all foreign mining contracts. Niger suspended 3 uranium extraction licenses. The tide was shifting. Ghana soon announced an audit of all foreign-owned agricultural operations that had been siphoning wealth for generations. On social media, #Burkina Stands Up became a global trend, shared millions of times across every platform. Clips of Traoré's speech subtitled in dozens of languages spread faster than any corporate campaign. Young Africans flooded timelines with their own stories of exploitation, a living catalog of modern colonialism. Economists everywhere weighed in. Some called Traoré's move economic suicide. Others hailed it as long overdue decolonization. The world was watching, and the old assumptions were breaking apart. As the 72-hour deadline loomed, cracks finally appeared in European unity, and the first came from the most unlikely place: Wilhelm Krauss of Continental Mining, the very man who had once insisted Burkina Faso could not survive without European expertise. In a private board meeting that would later leak, Krauss argued, with conviction, we could accept these terms and still be profitable. Less profitable, yes, but profitable. And if we're first to agree, we'll have the advantage when other African nations follow this path. His board hesitated, but Krauss had done the math with a survivor's precision. Even with 51% local ownership and higher wages, the mines would still generate hundreds of millions in profit. More importantly, Continental Mining could rebrand itself not as an exploiter, but as a progressive partner. It could open doors across Africa. At our 68, Continental Mining announced it would accept Traoré's terms. The shock across the European business community was like watching soldiers defect. Mid-battle, traitor, Romano roared, during a heated phone call that echoed through the walls of his luxury hotel. But Krauss was unmoved. His reply carried the certainty of a man who had glimpsed the future. I'm a businessman, Alejandro. I see which way the wind is blowing, do you? The dominoes fell quickly. 2 more companies announced they would remain under the new terms. Others scrambled for last-minute concessions, their former arrogance replaced with desperate pragmatism, but most driven by pride, shareholder pressure, or sheer refusal to accept a world where they were no longer masters. Chose only one option. By the deadline, 11 of the 14 companies had announced their withdrawal from Burkina Faso. The headlines wrote themselves, dramatic enough to make Hollywood envious. European exodus from Burkina Faso. Traoré's gamble, liberation or suicide. The 7-minute speech that shook Africa. At the airport, the departing executives tried one last time to control the story. In front of cameras, Henrik Anderson declared, "This is a dark day for Burkina Faso. They've chosen ideology over prosperity." But even as he spoke, his phone buzzed with furious shareholder messages about abandoned assets and profits that would haunt balance sheets for years. Meanwhile, the 3 companies that stayed found themselves in an unexpected position. Jonathan Pierce of Meridian Extraction, who had resisted until the last moment, but ultimately accepted the terms, told his board with cautious optimism, "We are now the senior Western partners in what may become Africa's most important economic experiment. And if it works, and I'm starting to believe it might, we'll be perfectly positioned for the new Africa." The immediate aftermath was messy, as revolutions always are. The Burkinabe franc lost 20% of its value in 3 days. International credit agencies slashed ratings. Like vultures circling carrion, some foreign aid was suspended in retaliation. But then, something no economist had predicted happened. Remittances from the Burkinabe diaspora surged by 300% in a single month. People around the world sent money home to support their nation's bold stand. And new partners stepped forward. Several Middle Eastern investment funds announced major infrastructure projects, betting on the future of a country rewriting its destiny. A consortium of Indian technology companies soon proposed a digital transformation program that dwarfed anything the Europeans had ever offered. Even more surprising, applications to Burkina Faso's universities surged by 500%. Young Africans from across the continent wanted to study in the country that had shown them what was possible. 3 months later, when the dust began to settle, the picture was complex but far from the disaster many had predicted. Unemployment had spiked as foreign operations shut down, but numbers were already falling as local businesses stepped in to take over abandoned facilities. The economy had contracted, yet signs of stabilization emerged sooner than even the most optimistic analysts expected. But the most important change couldn't be measured in numbers. It was intangible, but undeniable. A new sense of possibility. In an interview with Al Jazeera, watched across Africa, Traoré reflected on those 7 minutes with quiet clarity. "I didn't plan to change everything with that speech. I simply told the truth about exploitation, about dignity, about our right to shape our own future. It turns out that's all our people needed to hear." The 14 European companies that once dominated Burkina Faso's economy were reduced to 3, operating under terms that just months earlier would have been unthinkable. Yet perhaps the greatest impact wasn't in Burkina Faso at all. It was in boardrooms across Europe, where executives dealing with Africa now faced a new reality. The era of easy exploitation was over. A 7-minute speech had made that clear. 1 year later, economists called it the Ouagadougou precedent. 5 African nations had since adopted similar policies. Corporations adapted, some willingly, others grudgingly, to the new reality. African resources would now come with African terms. The world hadn't ended, the sky hadn't fallen, but the global balance of power had shifted. At the modest community center in Ouagadougou, where it all began, a plaque was placed on the wall. It read simply, "Here, on March 15, 2024, President Ibrahim Traoré spoke for 7 minutes and 23 seconds. Africa listened. The world changed." The 14 CEOs who sat in that room would never forget those minutes. Some, like Anderson, spent years locked in lawsuits, becoming cautionary tales for future business students. Others, like Krauss, built new business models rooted in real partnership and found success they hadn't imagined. But all of them knew they had witnessed history, the moment when one man's calm words ended an era of exploitation that had seemed as permanent as the African sun. 7 minutes. That's all it took. 7 minutes of truth, spoken without anger or hatred, in a modest room filled with ordinary people who had waited generations to hear it. Today, Business schools dissect those 7 minutes as a masterclass in moral authority. Political scientists study it as a turning point in post-colonial economics. But for those who were in that room, it was far simpler. It was the day someone finally said what needed to be said. And in saying it changed everything. The final twist came 6 months later, like the last act of a play about power and reckoning. Henrik Anderson, the same CEO who had fled Burkina Faso in panic, was caught on hidden camera by Swedish journalists at what he thought was a private dinner. His words spilled out, words that would haunt him forever. Traoré was right. We were parasites. For 40 years, we took everything and gave nothing back. Maybe it's better this way. The video went viral, racking up millions of views across Africa. Shared with the joy of vindication, within days, Anderson was forced to resign. But his reluctant confession became an unexpected validation of everything Traoré had said. Meanwhile, the 3 companies that stayed behind were reporting something remarkable to their shareholders, something that shattered every assumption about business in Africa. Employee productivity had doubled. Theft and sabotage, once rampant, had all but disappeared. Local communities began protecting company infrastructure as if it were their own. Jonathan Pierce of Meridian Extraction later told the Financial Times in an interview that would become required reading in business schools. When people feel like partners, not servants, everything changes. We should have learned this decades ago. The final vindication came from a source no one expected. Not even Traoré's fiercest supporters. 18 months after the speech, the World Bank's annual report included a special section on what it cautiously called the Burkina Faso model. In carefully worded, diplomatic language, the report admitted what many had long suspected, that traditional development approaches may have inadvertently perpetuated dependency rather than fostering genuine growth. It was the closest the institution had ever come to saying outright that Traoré had been right all along. In Ouagadougou, life moved with a new rhythm. The modest community center where those 7 minutes of history had been spoken became a kind of pilgrimage site. Young entrepreneurs stood where Traoré had stood, drawing inspiration from the same floorboards. Students sat where the CEOs once sat, imagining the fear and confusion of those who thought themselves untouchable. And sometimes, late in the evening when the crowds had gone, Mama Salamata would still come by, the elderly woman whom Traoré had pointed to during his speech. She would tell anyone who would listen, her voice carrying the weight of lived experience, "I worked 30 years for them and got nothing but pain in my bones. That day, my president spoke for 7 minutes and gave me back my dignity. That is worth more than all the gold they ever took from our earth." Her words captured what no economist or political scientist could quantify. In those 7 minutes, Ibrahim Traoré had not only renegotiated contracts or changed trade terms, he had given a people back their pride, and that, perhaps, was worth more than all the billions extracted from African soil across decades of exploitation. The revolution had begun with 7 minutes of truth. What followed would reshape not just Burkina Faso, not just Africa, but the entire relationship between the developed and developing world. Because once people remember their worth, they never forget it.